What is going on, guys? Nate here, and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls 6 location video. Today we'll be covering Elsweyr as yet another potential location for the next Elder Scrolls game. Again, this video is part of a bit of a mini-series that we're doing here on the channel, in which we look at all the regions of Tamriel and discuss how they would/could function as settings for the Elder Scrolls 6. And this video is not the exception to that. We're going to be taking a look at the mystical land of deserts and cat people as the current subject. Now, first off, as I like to do, a bit of background information and history. Currently, Elsweyr is dominated by the Khajiit, a race of felines combined with some sort of elven or human features who generally submit to a spiritual leader known as, quote-unquote, the Main, who is born in a particularly uncommon lunar eclipse-like event. Now, one might wonder what happens if two Khajiit are born during this time, and what happens to the old Main? Well, we don't exactly know, but a new main is chosen every time that happens. Now, rewinding back to the first era, the Khajiit were most likely created by some sort of deity, combining cat-like features with those of elven ones, and were placed in the geographically diverse region we know now as Elsweyr. And in the early years following the emergence of the Khajiit, their population in Elsweyr was largely divided between various warring tribes. But by the second era, a formal government was established, as the two most powerful of these tribes, the Aniquina and the Palatine, or Palatine, I'm sorry, I don't speak cat, united and conquered the rest of them, unifying their holdings into one state, which they would call Elsweyr, based on an old Khajiit saying that goes, quote, "The perfect society is always Elsweyr." Many of the old tribal leaders were unhappy after being forced to submit to these new rulers, and rebelled. They even captured the old capital of the Aquina. The Main, however, soon stepped in and brokered a very uneasy peace, where power would actually cycle between these semi-successful rebels and the previous government of Elsweyr, depending on the phases of the two moons. Now, surprisingly enough, deciding a government based off of what the moon looks like doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, and with neither of these two formerly warring powers in permanent control, the Main soon became the most powerful leader in all of Elsweyr, even more powerful than these two governments. But in the year 560 of the Second Era, a horrible plague broke out, and the region yet again fell back into chaos. And the fact that the government was periodically changing hands every couple of months, shockingly enough, didn't help. So the Main oversaw another agreement to allow Elsweyr to join the Aldemari Dominion, and all was seemingly well for a few years, because in the late days of the Second Era, the Third Legion of the Empire invaded, and captured the Khajiit city of Senkal. The Empire proceeded to capture a significant portion of northern Elsweyr by the beginning of the Third Era, despite some Khajiit resistance. The slim remaining portions of Elsweyr that still remained under Khajiit/Aldemari control were invaded by a faction of Wood Elves from Valenwood, further destabilizing the region. And despite an eventual Khajiit victory over these Wood Elves, major damage was already done. And in the year 49 of the Fourth Era, the Main was assassinated. But somehow, for a very brief period of time, Elsweyr was completely free of Imperial control. Whether or not they peacefully got the Empire to exit or rebelled with might, we're not sure of, but we do know the Empire was gone for a little while, only for them to come back and completely conquer the region. Now, we don't know the details of this Imperial conquest, whether they invaded, captured cities, or if they just peacefully signed a few agreements and got the entire region into their hands. But we do know by the mid-Fourth Era, the Empire was in control of the entirety of Elsweyr, with little exceptions. But as fate would have it, the Empire soon found itself locked in a war with the Aldemari Dominion, known as the Great War. But Elsweyr was largely excluded and ignored by both powers. The Empire didn't particularly draft many Khajiits, and the Thalmor didn't really pay any militaristic attention to it either. And around the time of the war, with Imperial resentment high among Khajiits for invading their lands many years ago, the Thalmor began to eye the province, hoping for an opportunity to get it to defect without actually sending troops. And that opportunity came with the Void of Nights, an event in which the moons that the Khajiit so much depended on to choose their leaders literally disappeared for 2 years. However, they did come back, and when they did, the Thalmor took the credit for it, saying that some form of their magic was responsible for returning them. The Khajiit immediately hailed the Thalmor as their saviors, and following an unsuccessful coup to usurp the Main in 115 of the Fourth Era, Elsweyr entirely became a client state of the Aldemari Dominion, and that is currently where we are left off at now. From what we can assume, the Empire still wants this region back, and what we're beginning to see is a theme that is commonly reflected in other provinces throughout Tamriel. If you look at Hammerfell, Valenwood, same thing happening with Elsweyr. The Empire and the Thalmor jockeying for power over a region, as some poor little native population sits there and is stuck in the middle. It's definitely an interesting stage for a game to be set, however I do have some reservations about it. For one, all of the previous Elder Scrolls games have taken place in settings with a population the player can be familiar with, something that the player can be reminded of. You've got this weird medieval setting in Skyrim, this somewhat medieval setting in Oblivion, and then you've got the elven setting of Morrowind, in which elves have been popularized by Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and, well, Christmas. Bethesda stays very close to that human/elven population sort of thing, with very few exceptions, and I don't entirely think that's a coincidence. I think they like doing these games, where they take place in human environments, or occasionally an elven settlement or two, and that's why we haven't seen an Elder Scrolls in Argonia or elsewhere. Bethesda doesn't want to deviate too far from that. It's much harder to make a game and attract an audience for something that people don't have much experience knowing about. When I first picked up Oblivion, I was attracted by pictures of what looked to be like armored knights and reviews I was watching, and said, hey, that looks cool, that reminds me of something, I'm gonna pick this up. Whereas I don't think a similar sensation would occur with cat people, unless you're into that sort of thing, in which case that's fine, you do you, but most people aren't exactly familiar with that sort of setting, so I think it might be a little bit more difficult for Bethesda to sell, and I'm confident they know that. Now, in spite of its rather exotic population, Elsweyr does kind of fit some of the quote-unquote checks on the list for things Bethesda likes to include in their games. One, it's very much geographically diverse. There's a huge desert, very many forests scattered throughout the region, as well as many beaches. There's a lot for Bethesda to work with, geographically speaking, and we know they really, really like it that way. Furthermore, the whole main figure does represent an interesting sort of chosen one feel Bethesda likes to do with their games. You know, you are the Dragonborn, you are the chosen one. Perhaps a game in Elsweyr, you could be the main, or the great leader of its population. Now, how exactly it would work in getting to customize your player race and whatnot, I'm not exactly sure. Writing isn't inherently my job, but Bethesda could possibly make that work. Also, there are a lot of gaps in its history. You know, I mentioned it was briefly liberated from Imperial control, then fell right back into it? Well, what exactly happened there? What was the whole Void of Nights thing about? I highly doubt that Thalmor actually instigated it. What exactly really went down there? There's a lot of stories that we don't know the answers to that Bethesda could tell in a very interesting way. And then, of course, its current situation is also very much interesting for another Elder Scrolls game. So while its exotic population of cat people might not exactly be the norm in most fantasy titles, with the humans and elves being the things that generally dominate alongside orcs, it still presents a very interesting possibility as it meets a lot of the other quote-unquote requirements or preferences Bethesda has for locating their titles. But anyway, guys, I'm gonna wrap the video up right here. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, this is a bit of a mini-series I'm doing. There will be a playlist on my channel to more videos very similar to this one, dissecting other provinces of Tamriel that could be a possible location. Anyway, guys, again, like if you enjoyed, dislike if you did not, and I hope to see you all in my next video. Peace out, everybody.